The occupation did not begin with tanks on every street. It began with schedules, with rules about when people could move, where they could go, and how quickly a city was expected to function. In Prague, the trams still ran. They rang their bells. They followed their routes. They carried workers to factories and offices that now served a different power. On paper, the city was efficient, orderly, under control. And every morning, at exactly the same hour, one man quietly disrupted that order. In most accounts of war, history gravitates toward the same figures: generals, strategists, commanders whose decisions leave visible marks on maps and in archives. Their authority is easy to recognize because it was designed to be seen. But large systems, especially those built to control occupied populations, rarely depend on visible power alone. They function because thousands of small, unremarkable roles perform their tasks the same way, every day, without attracting attention. The more ordinary the role, the safer it is assumed to be. In occupied Czechoslovakia, tram drivers belonged firmly to that category. Public transport ran on nearly the same schedules as before. After the occupation, Prague did not stop moving. That was intentional. A city that continues to function is easier to manage than one in collapse. Factories reopened. Offices resumed work. Public transport ran on nearly the same schedules as before. The trams in particular became essential. They carried workers to industrial districts, clerks to administrative buildings, and technicians to sites that now serve the occupying authorities. Every morning, tens of thousands of people relied on the tram network to arrive exactly where they were expected to be, at precisely the right time. Under occupation, time itself became a resource. A delayed worker was not merely late, he disrupted a process. A delayed process forced another department to wait. Waiting created pressure. Pressure accumulated into inefficiency. And inefficiency was something the occupation could not afford. Tram drivers were not considered part of this problem. They were considered infrastructure. Their job was mechanical, repetitive, and highly regulated. Routes were fixed. Stops were predetermined. Timetables were printed and distributed in advance. Drivers were trained to minimize variation, to accelerate smoothly, brake consistently, and spend roughly the same amount of time at each stop. The entire system depended on the assumption that one driver was interchangeable with another. From the perspective of the authorities, this made tram drivers safe. They did not choose destinations. They did not control cargo. They were not near weapons, fuel depots, or communication centers. Their work was visible to passengers, inspectors, and officials who rode the same trams. Any disruption, it was assumed, would be obvious. What this view failed to recognize was the difference between rules and rhythm. A timetable is a set of instructions. A rhythm is how those instructions are carried out in real time. Two drivers can follow the same schedule and still produce different outcomes. One brakes slightly earlier, another accelerates more gently. One waits a few extra seconds before closing the doors. Individually, these differences are insignificant. Normally, the system absorbs them. They are treated as noise. But noise, when applied deliberately and repeatedly, stops being accidental. The tram system, like most urban transport networks, was designed to tolerate small inconsistencies. It could not tolerate sustained uncertainty. A single delayed tram was manageable. A morning in which timing subtly drifted across multiple routes was not. The authorities did not monitor tram drivers closely because they had no reason to. Urban transport was considered civilian space. Inspected, yes, but not scrutinized in detail. If congestion formed, it was blamed on traffic. If schedules slipped, it was blamed on volume. If a junction clogged, it was blamed on the city itself. No one asked whether a driver had chosen to act differently. Choice was not part of the mental model. The man at the center of this story did not stand out. He wore the same uniform as the others. He followed the same route each morning. He did not speak to passengers more than necessary. He did not attract attention. Like many under occupation, He did not see himself as someone with power. He did not believe his job mattered beyond earning a living. Yet every morning, he occupied a precise position in the system, between planning and reality, between schedule and street. He did not create movement, but he shaped its tempo. He determined how long his tram occupied an intersection, whether it caught or missed a signal, whether it closed the gap with the tram ahead or widened it. These were not dramatic decisions. They were barely perceptible, but they mattered. The most sensitive hours were the mornings. Between 6 and 9, the city compressed itself into motion. Workers, clerks, and administrators converged on specific districts in tightly synchronized waves. If those waves arrived as expected, the rest of the day often unfolded smoothly. If they did not, recovery required constant adjustment. For planners, this was the most fragile window. For anyone positioned inside the system, it was also the most exposed. The occupation authorities looked for sabotage that resembled sabotage, broken rails, disabled vehicles, missing components. They did not look for discipline applied imperfectly. They did not imagine that someone could obey every rule and still apply pressure. That blind spot was structural. The system believed obedience was binary. A worker complied or he resisted. There was no category for compliance used strategically. And so the city continued to move. Trams ran, passengers boarded, schedules were followed, on paper. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. That normality was not accidental. It was the condition that made what followed possible. At the beginning, there was nothing to notice. A tram arrived. It departed. Another followed. The city woke up and moved as it always had. No one marked the moment as significant. No report was filed. No line was drawn. But the system had already begun to feel a difference it could not yet name. And it began, not with a grand decision, but with a man doing an ordinary job in a slightly different way at the most important time of day. At first, nothing he did could have been described as a disruption. He did not skip stops. He did not violate speed limits. He did not ignore signals or challenge inspectors. Every action remained within the acceptable range of professional judgment. If questioned, he could have justified each decision individually. That was the point. The tram he drove followed a route that crossed several major arteries of the city. During peak hours, those intersections functioned like valves, opening and closing to regulate pressure. When trams passed through them on time, the city breathed normally. When they lingered just a little too long, congestion did not announce itself immediately. It crept outward. He learned quickly that seconds mattered more than minutes. A full minute of delay would be noticed. It would be recorded. It would invite explanation. But 10 seconds at a stop could be dismissed as boarding time. 15 seconds at an intersection could be blamed on traffic. 5 seconds added repeatedly, in the right places, would never appear as a single cause. The tram driver understood something the planners did not. The system measured time in aggregates, but lived in increments. Each morning, he adjusted the rhythm of his route slightly. He waited until the platform was completely clear before closing the doors. He accelerated more gently than necessary, just enough to miss the green signal he would normally catch. He allowed small gaps to widen rather than closing them. None of this violated procedure. It simply altered the pattern. The effect was not immediate. The first tram behind him slowed slightly. The next one arrived at a stop where the platform was more crowded than expected. Passengers took longer to board. A queue formed. At the next junction, signals adjusted automatically to manage the increased load, extending red lights elsewhere. A cross-route tram missed its window. The system compensated. It always did. But compensation came at a cost. Behind every automatic adjustment was a human decision. A dispatcher rerouted a vehicle. A supervisor extended a shift. A factory foreman waited for workers who were technically late, but not late enough to penalize. Each small correction created friction. Friction produced heat. Heat produced stress. None of it could be traced back to a single tram. By the end of the week, Morning congestion began appearing in places where it had not before. Not dramatically, not consistently, just enough to be irritating. Passengers complained, but vaguely. Inspectors filed notes, but inconclusively. No pattern emerged that could be isolated. And so the system adjusted again. This was the part that surprised him most. He had expected resistance. He had expected intervention. Instead, the system behaved like a living organism trying to heal itself. It rerouted pressure. It tightened controls in one area and loosened them in another. In doing so, it made itself more complex and more fragile. He did not act every day. That would have been a mistake. Some mornings, he drove exactly as expected. On those days, the system relaxed. Data smoothed out. Supervisors stopped paying attention. When pressure returned later, it appeared spontaneous, unconnected. He learned to read the city. He noticed when platforms were fuller than usual, when intersections hesitated, when trams ahead of him closed doors more quickly, as if trying to regain lost time. Those were signals, not alarms, but indicators that the system was already compensating. That was when he intervened least. The goal was not to overwhelm. It was to keep the system permanently slightly off balance. The occupation relied on predictability. Predictability allowed authorities to plan deployments, schedule labor, and manage surveillance. A city that arrived on time was easier to control than one that was merely functional. What he introduced was not chaos, but variability. To planners, variability looked like noise. To operators, it felt like fatigue. To passengers, it felt like a city that was inexplicably harder to move through. Everyone adjusted, no one accused. By the second month, the changes had spread beyond his route. Other drivers began to compensate without understanding why. Some drove faster, some cut dwell times. Others hesitated, unsure whether they were early or late. Their adjustments overlapped, interfered, canceled each other out in some places, and amplified delays in others. The network grew less efficient, not enough to trigger intervention, but enough to degrade performance. This was the most dangerous phase. Not because he was at risk, but because the system was looking, not for him, but for a cause. When systems search for causes, they do not look where nothing appears broken. They look where damage is visible. Inspectors focused on junctions. Engineers examined signals. Administrators revised timetables. New directives were issued. None addressed the source because the source did not resemble a problem. He continued to drive. He did not tell anyone what he was doing. There was no need. This was not a coordinated action. It did not require trust. It required only consistency and restraint. There were moments when he considered stopping, not from fear, but from doubt. The effects were diffuse. He could not see what mattered. He could not measure success. There were no signs of victory, only signs of strain. But strain, he understood, was cumulative. Every morning that began slightly out of sync forced the city to expend effort correcting itself. That effort was invisible, but finite. Over time, it reduced resilience. It made everything slower to recover, harder to stabilize. In an occupied city, resilience was the real enemy of resistance. He did not imagine himself as a saboteur. He was a tram driver who drove carefully, attentively, and just differently enough to matter. By the time officials began discussing systemic inefficiencies in internal meetings, the behavior had already become part of the network. There was nothing to remove without dismantling normal operations. And the city continued to move, slower, less smoothly, more uncertainly, every morning. Not because of one man, but because one man had found the narrow space between rules and reality and learned how to stay there without being seen. The first sign that something had changed was not a warning. It was a meeting. Not an interrogation, not a summons, just a notice pinned to the depot board, written in neutral language announcing a routine operational review. Attendance required. No names mentioned. No accusations implied. Meetings like this happen from time to time. Usually they meant little: a new timetable, a reminder about procedures, sometimes nothing at all. But this one was scheduled early, before the first morning routes, which meant it mattered. The tram driver arrived as usual. He sat where he always sat. He listened more than he spoke. The supervisors talked about congestion patterns, about passenger complaints that could not be traced to specific delays, about the system losing rhythm during peak hours. They used technical language, flow rates, intersection saturation, cascading variance. No one mentioned resistance. No one mentioned sabotage. They spoke as if the city itself had developed a habit. Charts were shown, lines overlapped, averages looked acceptable, variability did not. The problem, they said, was inconsistency. That word stayed with him. Inconsistency was dangerous because it invited correction, and correction invited scrutiny. After the meeting, new guidelines were issued. Not rules, recommendations. Drivers were encouraged to adhere more closely to ideal dwell times, to maintain uniform acceleration profiles, to avoid unnecessary hesitation at stops during peak hours. Nothing was enforceable. Everything was measurable. The system was learning. From that morning on, he adjusted again, not his actions, but their visibility. He made sure his tram appeared exemplary: clean stops, smooth motion, no obvious hesitation. If anything, he now drove more precisely than before. But precision, he understood, could still be selective. The city's rhythm had already shifted. He no longer needed to create delay. He needed only to avoid correcting it. When the system presented him with a choice, recover time or preserve spacing, he preserved spacing. When he arrived slightly early, he did not rush to align. When he arrived slightly late, he did not compensate aggressively. He let small errors remain. This was more subtle than before, more difficult to notice, and more effective. The occupation authorities believed that control came from tightening procedures, but tightening increased sensitivity. Sensitivity amplified noise. Within weeks, enforcement became uneven. Some depots were scrutinized, others ignored. Some drivers were warned for trivial deviations. Others were praised for punctuality that masked instability elsewhere. The network responded by fragmenting. Tram lines stopped behaving like parts of a whole. Each route optimized locally. Each driver compensated differently. The system lost its shared sense of time. This was when suspicion began, not of him, but of everyone. Supervisors compared reports. Engineers blamed dispatchers. Dispatchers blamed outdated data. Meetings grew longer. Decisions grew slower. Authority became cautious. In an occupied city, caution was costly. The tram driver felt the tension in small ways. Inspectors boarded trams more frequently. They stood near the front, watching hands, watching faces. They asked routine questions with rehearsed casualness. There were days when he could have slowed the system further. Days when congestion presented itself like an open door. He did nothing. Let others compensate. Let noise mask intention. The hardest part was knowing when not to act. This was not about courage. It was about patience. He understood now that visibility was the real threat. Not being wrong, but being noticeable. Not causing delay, but being associated with it. And so he faded. Not into obedience, but into statistical normality. The city continued to struggle with its mornings. Not dramatically, not consistently, just enough that schedules could no longer be trusted fully. Factories adjusted start times unofficially. Offices allowed grace periods. People arrived when they arrived. Control loosened, not because anyone ordered it, but because enforcing precision became too costly. That was the quiet victory. No announcement marked it. No one acknowledged it. The system simply stopped insisting on perfection. Eventually, attention moved elsewhere, to fuel shortages, to labor disputes, to matters that could be named and confronted. The trams became background again. The driver remained at his post. He did not know whether his actions had changed anything measurable. He would never see reports from above. He would never know how many decisions had been delayed, how many plans disrupted, how many resources misallocated because the city no longer moved exactly as expected. What he knew was this: the occupation depended on systems behaving as designed, and for a time, the city had not. When the war ended, there was no reckoning. No one reviewed tram logs for those years. No one compared schedules to outcomes. The records existed, but they told no story, just numbers within acceptable margins. The driver retired quietly. His route changed. The trams were replaced. The city found a new rhythm. History recorded none of it, but every system has limits, and sometimes the most effective way to resist is not to break those limits, but to live just inside them and let the system exhaust itself trying to stay whole. There was no final act, no last morning when the tram driver decided that this would be the day he stopped, no dramatic reversal, no moment of resolution that would later make sense in hindsight. The city simply changed. By the later years of the occupation, the urgency that had once defined the mornings began to thin, not disappear, but dull. Priorities shifted, routes were altered, resources were stretched in new directions. The tram system still mattered, but it no longer carried the same weight it once had. Schedules became suggestions, delays became expected. What had once felt like instability slowly hardened into routine. The driver still arrived before dawn, still took his place behind the controls, still guided the tram along the same streets, past the same buildings, through intersections that no longer demanded perfect timing. The city had adapted, not by fixing the problem, but by living with it. And in doing so, it had lost something important. Predictability had been a form of power. When that power faded, so did a certain confidence. Orders were issued with more caution. Assumptions were made with less certainty. The city functioned, but without the sharp efficiency the occupation had relied upon. The driver did not know when his actions stopped mattering. Perhaps they never did in isolation. Perhaps they only mattered in combination with thousands of other adjustments, compromises, and quiet refusals made by people who never spoke to one another. That was the nature of it. Resistance of this kind had no center, no leader, no message. It spread not through coordination but through shared conditions, through systems pushed beyond the point where they could be perfectly controlled. When the end finally came, it arrived unevenly. Uniforms disappeared first, then insignia, then the tone of authority softened. Offices emptied, directives stopped coming. The trams continued to run. No one asked the driver what he had done during those years. No one examined his records for hidden meaning. The logs were archived, then forgotten. Their small inconsistencies dissolved into larger data sets that told no story at all. History prefers clarity. It remembers explosions, declarations, and victories that can be named. It struggles with actions that look like nothing while they are happening. The driver did not consider himself brave. He did not consider himself important. He had not set out to resist in any grand sense. He had only noticed a weakness and learned how to stand inside it without being seen. After the war, the tram system was rebuilt. New schedules, new vehicles, new clocks. The city found a different rhythm. The past was not examined too closely. It rarely is. If someone were to look back now, they would find no evidence of what happened. No proof that a city once moved more slowly because one man chose not to correct small errors. No record of how many plans were delayed, how many resources arrived late, how many assumptions quietly failed. And yet, the truth remains. Large systems do not fail only when they are attacked. Sometimes they fail because they are gently misused, because they are forced to compensate again and again until adaptation becomes weakness. War is often remembered as a contest of force, but it is also a contest of endurance, of who can maintain control and who can make that control just difficult enough to sustain. The tram driver's name does not appear in history books. His actions do not fit into timelines. They cannot be commemorated. But for a time, in an occupied city that depended on precision, the mornings did not unfold exactly as planned. And sometimes, that is enough. War is often remembered through decisive moments, through battles, orders, and victories that can be clearly named. But most resistance does not look like defiance. It looks like routine, like small choices made inside systems that expect obedience. If you want to continue exploring these quiet stories, stories of ordinary people who disrupted power without ever being seen, subscribe to the channel. Not to glorify war, but to remember that history is also shaped by those who chose not to let systems work perfectly.